This story has not been woven together yet until now. And you're going to hear why it's such an important story. Because it really humanizes Israel. It is the story that can help our Zionism stand taller. It is the story that is remarkably non-political. And boy, is that refreshing these days. It's a story that a master storyteller in Aviva Klompas writes, so it's quite easy to read. And I would dare say that this book is not only a great story about Israel's impact in the wider world, but it's also a great history of the state. Very often people are asking, is there a book out there that can actually tell Israel's story? So you get to meet the figures. Because as Aviva tells you who Ben Gurion was, who Herzl was, who Golda was, right? In the unique and remarkable way that she does. So I'm going to now ask a first question, and the format for tonight is I'll ask a few questions, and then if you have questions or want to follow up on something that you're hearing, feel free to raise your hand. We'll give you the mic and invite you to do so. I have a bunch of questions. We'll then open it up to you, and we'll have a chance to appreciate just what a remarkable book, Standup Nation, Israel's Resilience in the Wake of Disaster is. So Aviva, I want you to begin, if you wouldn't mind, by telling us your story. That is the origin story of this book, what brings Aviva Klompas to this work. We know that you worked at the UN as a very important speechwriter for the state of Israel, the ambassador of Israel. We know that you've done great work at Boundless, and so before that at CJP, and you have over 300,000 Twitter followers. By the way, I made no secret of the fact that I want to get to Aviva to 600,000 Twitter followers before too long, which would put her right where the number of letters of the Torah, the children of Israel, and we're at, and that's where she belongs. But Aviva, if you would tell us the origin story of the birth of the book, what brought you to the work, and perhaps even an additional word about what you added to the book post-October the 7th. But first, the origin story of the book.
Thank you, Rabbi Hamilton, and thank you, Litel. It's such a joy, really, to be here and to be able to do this in Boston, and in particular to do it with two very, very good friends, dear friends, whom I admire so much and I love so much. And so thank you to both of you for your kindness. The origin, and thank you all for coming, it's really nice. This book is 10 years in the making. So I was the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations 10 years ago. I wrote for Ambassador Ron Persor. That is a whole series of stories, which is actually encapsulated in the first book that I wrote, which is called Speaking for Israel, which when I said to my publisher, I didn't speak for Israel, I wrote for Israel. He said to me, don't be so literal. But the book is called Speaking for Israel. So Israel at the UN has exactly one speechwriter, and there is an enormous workload because you're responsible for all English language communications, so speeches, but also letters to the President of the General Assembly and the Security Council, which are written over every incident. A shepherd crosses this line, a fisherman that line, in addition to all the security issues, a letter has to go and it has to be documented, and then there's also op-eds and social media and all sorts of other things. And it's overwhelming. The UN deals with an enormous range of issues. We hear about it in the context of peace and security, but there's economic development, international development, there's outer space and road safety and forestry and literally every topic imaginable. And so I didn't spend a lot of time delving into all the different topics, but whenever I had to write a speech on international development, I would fall down a rabbit hole because I would find myself reading about all the things that I love. The pioneering story of Israel, determination, audacity, Golda Meir, all the things combined together are part of Israel's origin and international development. And I thought to myself, how is it that nobody knows this incredible story? That even people that have been to Israel dozens of times and are very familiar, or even Israeli, don't necessarily know about Mashav, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation. And I left, when Ambassador Prosor left his job at the UN, I left as well. And I founded an initiative right here in Boston called Project Inspire. And we were taking young Jews around the world to see firsthand Israel's work in international development. And I led study tours to Kenya and Uganda and Nepal and Guatemala and India and all sorts of places. And we had a trip planned in 2020 to go to Tanzania, and the pandemic. We couldn't travel anymore. And realizing it was going to be a long time until we could start to travel, instead of going myself, I started to write the story instead. So this book is 4 years of writing. I'm a slow writer. And what the book details is, the first part of it is the history of Israel's work in international development. And I still think, it gives me chills when I tell the story, it's the most remarkable thing. Israel in its earliest years is facing insurmountable challenges. We know it's fighting wars of survival. It's also desperately poor. It is a developing country. And the reason is that first of all, it's a country of immigrants largely. So you have the survivors of the Holocaust, and you also have about 800,000 Jews who flee from the surrounding Arab countries. And so when you have Holocaust survivors and refugees, you have people that are coming essentially penniless, and they need everything. They need to learn, they need a place to live, they need food, they need education, they need jobs, they need language training, and it's sort of an endless list. In the first 2 years of Israel's life, its population doubles. And the state is trying to fight these wars of survival at the same time. And so what it does is it sets up mabarot, which are basically tent encampments. It's tin or wooden little shacks. There's no running water. There's no real hygiene. They have to set up a ministry of rationing. There isn't enough food. It's not the land of milk and honey. It's dry and arid, or it's swampy and malaria-ridden. And you can't import because it doesn't have friends around the world, doesn't have friendly neighbors, and it has a currency that's almost going to collapse constantly. And it's in that context that Israel founds an international development agency. It's quite unbelievable. So in the book, I tell the story of how that comes to be. And then I profile about 20 different Israelis, present day, who are working in this field. And I try to answer the question, why is Israel doing so much work outside of its borders, and what is motivating them to be able to do so?
Powerful. I want to probe a little deeper. By the way, isn't the Israel Corporation in development actually as old or older than some other rather prominent ones?
Read closely, it's true. Israel has an international development agency before the US has USAID. It has, before the UN has the UN's development program, before Canada, before Great Britain. Israel is one of the first countries in the world to extend a hand in friendship and support to people all over the world.
It's incredible. So it's in the Declaration of Independence of Israel. And even more, I want to ask a deeper question, Aviva, because Ben-Gurion says, this work is as necessary for Israel as it is for the recipients of the work. And Golda says that it stems from our deepest historic instincts, our most valued traditions as Jews. And the question I want to ask is, it's a very powerful notion that the source of one's dignity, if one has needs, for instance, we all have needs, the source of one's dignity isn't just having those needs met. The source of a human being's dignity is providing for the needs of others. So for instance, if somebody is in a very, very tough place in life and they require food and clothing and shelter and tzedakah, we would all agree that those are things that are important. But Judaism would add something. It would also require of them to give tzedakah, perhaps to somebody richer. Because in providing, they actually derive their sense of purpose, their sense of dignity. And so the question I want to ponder is, did the founders of Israel, who established in the midst of all of this immense need and all of these dangers and all of these uncertainties about whether the state would come into being and survive, did they intuit a sense that at the core of their Jewish sense of dignity comes from being a provider, not just having one's needs met, hopefully, but reaching out and meeting the needs of others, and they would understand from the very beginning that that would be the source of what it would be to have a Jewish state based on the dignity of Jewish values.
When you were talking, it just reminded me, my niece is about to go spend her year in Israel after high school, and she's very nervous about it, and it's making me think about when I went to go and study in Israel after high school. I was very homesick, and the first, like quite desperately homesick, and feeling quite sorry for myself. And I was walking back to the school one evening, and I saw a very old lady struggling with her grocery bags. So I went to go and help her and walked her home, and it was the first time that I felt better in that entire time. And it's just a reminder that when you do something for somebody else, it takes you out of the context of yourself, and it just changes your framework, and it's immensely powerful to be able to do that. And I think that when you look at Israel's Declaration of Independence, Jewish values are baked right into it. It says we extend our hand in friendship and support to our neighboring countries, to the countries of the world, and to the Jewish people, all of whom are invited to be a part of the project of building Israel. Now, most of them did not accept. Some of them still haven't accepted. But the idea was always that it was going to be outward looking, and it was going to be in partnership with we've never had an isolationist look about it. And I think that there is an inherent understanding that dignity comes from giving much more than getting. But on top of that, I would say, I think what we've always understood is that we are the authors of our own story. Throughout Jewish history, a lot has befallen us, a lot of heartbreak has befallen us, but that's not who we are. I don't define the Jewish people as a pogrom or a Holocaust or October 7th. Those are tragedies. They're a page in the story of our book. But what we've always understood is that we are building towards something. And even when we got knocked down, we stand up and we build again and again. Standup Nation.
Beautiful. So what's also powerful, as soon as you open this book, you come to realize that there is a sorting, an organization, an order in the book that, as Lital says, really creates the story, weaves it together marvelously. Aviva, you focus on four different approaches to doing good in the world, and being a citizen of the world, and bringing our everything we can to help. By the way, you might even mention briefly, just, I know there are 9 different areas, but they're the different areas in which Mashav and development work actually happens. But there's all these different areas where the difference is made, but you divide into 4 different kinds of change makers, doers. I wonder if you'd describe what those 4 types are and how you came to weave the story so masterfully to tell decide on these 4 different categories, and decide that if you're going to tell this story, which is so necessarily told, you're going to do it through these specific classifications.
Yeah, I snickered, as you said, how I wrote it so masterfully, because it was the 3rd attempt. I wrote the first attempt I wrote, and I stepped back and I read it, and I was like, man, this is self-centered. That's not going to work. And then I did it again, and it was a jumble. It was very hard to follow the stories. And so it actually took quite a lot of effort to figure it out. I shared that I actually started learning about this work well before I wrote the book. And I was out in these different developing countries, and I was just so curious about coming across Israel in the most unexpected of places. And I kept asking myself, why is it? I could be in the most remote part of Uganda on an island where I had to take a rickety bus, and then a boat that was leaking, and then another bus to get to this island, and then I find an orphanage, and the kids greet me holding Israeli flags and singing Hatikva. And I'm with a group of Americans, not a one of whom know the words to Hatikva, and I just said, how has this happened? And I would ask myself that over and over again throughout the years, and I was always trying to sort of figure it out. And in talking, especially doing these interviews with different Israelis, as I continued to talk to them, what I really realized is that there were 4 drivers for why people were doing what they were doing. And no person fits completely into one. There's always a bit of an overlap, but I tried to take what the main theme was, and that would be the chapter that they're placed in. So the 4 drivers for why Israel is doing this work around the world is idealism, pragmatism, adventurism, and then what I call chutzpahism. So idealism is tikkun olam. Those are the people that are driven by a sense of Jewish values and purpose and mission to help others who are less fortunate. Pragmatism is the simple fact that this enables people to lift their families out of poverty, lift communities out of poverty. There can be economic benefits, there can be social benefits. It's pure pragmatism. Adventurism, as we know, many Israelis, after they do their time in the army, will go backpacking, go trekking, go to the Hummus Trail in India. And when they're off doing that, they might come across a community and decide that they desperately feel like they want to do something. That happened to quite a few of them that are profiled in the book. And then you have chutzpahism. These are the most audacious of the audacious. And I say that about a people who are already very audacious. But they are sneaking into countries where Israel has no political or diplomatic relations in order to save lives, in order to do humanitarian development work, humanitarian relief work. And the consequences, if they're caught, is that at best they're jailed and most likely they're executed. And still they do this work.
I wonder if you'd share, you start with chutzpahism in the book,
Yeah.
and there are some fabulous people profiled. I wonder if you'd share a word about this remarkable woman, Galit
Gatski.
Oh
Yes.
my God! Because just the stories about her. I mean, the one thing that just becomes clear, we say that people aren't afraid of dying. What they're afraid of, in some ways, is not having ever really lived. Not having lived with a sense of meaning, like they've mattered, right? And nobody embodies that more than the story you tell about Gal. So say a few words about this remarkable woman.
Galit Gatski is born in the 1960s in a kibbutz in northern Israel, an old-fashioned kibbutz where she's raised in a children's home. She's the only girl, it's all boys, and she says that it taught her a lot of independence, so much so that when she was a teenager, she met a woman who was quite poor, and the woman needed help. She had a washing machine. And so Gal told her she could take her mother's washing machine. Her mother could just use the kibbutz laundry, and she gave her the washing machine. And in the 1990s, she saw the Rwandan genocide on television, and she was just struck by it, and she felt like she had to do something about it. Her brother had also just gotten injured in a war. She was very, very angry at the world, and she felt like she had to go and do something to help. She buys a one-way ticket to Rwanda. She's never been on the African continent, and she says, I'm just going to figure it out as I go. And she goes and she finds a nonprofit and she starts to do some work with them and basically becomes addicted to helping people, to chasing disaster. And that's what she does for many, many years. And she's going to disaster zone after disaster zone. Sometimes it's a hurricane or it's a volcano, but other times it's man-made disaster. And when it's man-made disaster, she very often notices that the government is weaponizing the disaster. So what they're saying is that we're going to declare this area, just so happens to be that's where the rebels that we disagree with live. We're going to declare it a closed humanitarian zone, and we're not going to allow any food or medicine in. But really, they're doing it in order to starve the population. And Gal found that appalling, and she saw that nobody in the world was doing anything about it, because the rule in international law is that you have to have the permission of the government for a humanitarian aid organization to come in, and the government would deny the permission. They'd say it's a closed humanitarian zone. And Gal said, nobody asked permission to kill, so I'm not going to ask permission to save lives. And she founded an Israeli organization called Israeli Flying Aid. And what they do is they go and they sneak into countries where Israel has no relations and where it's astoundingly dangerous. And the volunteers are kept very, very secret. A lot of them are Israeli Arabs who served in the IDF and have a unique skill set. For every type of disaster, she figures out what the volunteer composition is. And she tells me she's very afraid to die, but she's much more afraid of what it would look like to live, to know this is happening and to not do anything about it.
Extraordinary. So when it comes to the people, when we talk about chutzpah, and risk, it's really extraordinary, and you tell the stories in very, very powerfully in terms of that level of courage that's out there. I want to ask a question about believing in people, because there are a couple of really powerful stories here, actually more than a couple, Aviva, that you tell about how it is that people in parts of the world are capable of such incredible generosity. One of the organizations you're writing about is Nala. You'll describe it, but you describe here trekking through some of the world's poorest villages. As she discovered that the tougher the economic situation, the more hospitable the community. It was mind-blowing to see the generosity that people had relative to the little that they had. You learn that anywhere you go in the world, people can give, people can get, and they can partner. And then one other example, there's another cause where people are provided with medication, with necessary life-saving medication, and the staff in this particular case assures that the people receiving the medication that it's fine to pay later. Sometimes months will pass. They will come back to us with the rupees they owe, and they'll do their best, bit by bit, to repay. So I just wonder if you'd just talk about, we live in a world where trust is not particularly at a high point, where a sense of human nature is very much in question, especially with so much hate out there and so much that we see through online technology, and that's very ugly. These stories are just stories of glowing humanity and generosity. And through this work, do you start to believe in people more than perhaps you used to?
I spend a lot of time on X, on formerly called Twitter.
X is not a place where you get a lot of faith in people.
Learn to not believe in people. And I get a lot of hate directed at me, but I know that X is not the real world. X is a dystopia. And I mean, that's true from all sorts of levels. You can do public opinion polling of real people, and you get very different answers from what you see on X. And it's because of the anonymity, it's because there's lots of bots and foreign intervention and all sorts of different things. The fear is that if you have a world online, the dystopia is if everybody believes that's the reality, eventually it does become how they think. And that's what we have to fight against. And that's what I do in my day job in Boundless. But to answer your question, maybe first of all, I'll just say a word about Gabriel Project Mumbai. That was the second example that you gave. It's an incredible guy named Jacob Stotzman, who moved to Israel when he was an adult, worked in high tech, and he had a business meeting in India. And he goes to India, it's the first time, has a break in the meetings and goes for a walk. And if for anybody who's ever been to Mumbai, you can walk from a very nice affluent neighborhood and into a slum in a second, and they kind of bridge in and out of each other. So he finds himself in a slum, and he's seeing children in desperate conditions, begging and filthy and basically in the sewer, and he cannot get it out of his head. We go back to Israel, and he can't stop thinking about this little boy. Most of us, we see horrible things in the world, we feel terrible about it, and then it fades away, and we move on with our life. Jacob couldn't move on about it, and he had no experience in international development. As I said, he had never been to India before, and he couldn't shake it. He quit his job, did a master's degree in international development, and founded an organization called Gabriel Project Mumbai, which is working in some of the slums of Mumbai. And he's done all sorts of different things, but one of them is build a health center. And what he discovered was that when the healthcare was offered for free, which was the original plan, people were skeptical and they didn't come because they didn't think it was quality healthcare. So he charged them what is the equivalent of 25 cents. For the entire duration of your illness, you pay 25 cents. Now, even for some people, that's too much. And so the staff say to them, or they'll say, for the medication, you know what, I'm going to buy it somewhere else. I know somewhere I can get it cheaper. And the staff know that when people say that, it just means they can't afford it and they're embarrassed to say. So the staff will say, first of all, you can pay whatever you want, and you can also repay us on your own timeline. And that's the excerpt that you read. And a big part of international development work is being sensitive to the realities on the ground and having a good understanding of what's going on in terms of culture. To answer your question about trust, and one of the reasons that I'm so proud to put this book into the world and that I hope that it ends up in as many hands as possible is that encapsulated in this book is real Israel. In social media and in the news, we see Israel portrayed as a caricature of evil. But those of us who know Israel and know Israelis in particular know that's not the case. And the portraits of the people here in the work they do, adventurism, pragmatism, idealism, and chutzpahism, that's real Israel. That's really the heart of the Israeli people. So I don't have to regain trust. I always had it. I just hope other people can see it as well.
Powerful. And by the way, you pointed out also earlier when we were chatting that this idea of having to pay, that striking that balance between having to pay something so that it actually feels like it's real is more important than getting it for free, but also the shame of not being able to pay. So they're taught very, very carefully how to keep somebody's dignity. And the people take it very seriously, and they really pay over several months or even longer. It's quite remarkable. I want to just ask you to take a look at a part of the book that, this was the first part of the book I quoted when I first started reading it in one of my letters to the community, that had to do with the way in which Israel is understood in, yes, yeah, also Jacob. So I find this absolutely extraordinary where he is, it's an incident. You want to read it on page 111 right there in the middle? It's Jacob related an incident that took place. Yeah?
Yes, so in addition to Gabriel Project Mumbai, in addition to working in the slums, is also working with different farmers. The idea is that many people have the idea that they can make money if they move to the cities in India. And so they'll leave the rural communities in order to be able to do that because they haven't been able to make a living farming. The problem is they move to the cities and they end up in a slum because they don't find the opportunity that they're hoping for. So one of the things that Gabriel Project Mumbai does is it says, well, let's take how Israelis have figured out how to farm in the most impossible of conditions and teach those to farmers so that they will stay on their land and be able to support their families and they won't end up in the slums. So he's trying to get to the root causes of the problems and not just put a Band-Aid on top. Jacob related an incident that took place when he traveled to a particularly remote area called Palgar district, where locals rarely interacted with Westerners. Jacob and his team met with a group of farmers participating in their farming collective. Their faces went blank as they looked at me, Jacob says. I could feel that they were distrustful and that some even looked at me with disdain. That is, until his staff introduced him as being from Israel. Suddenly their faces became animated, he says with a laugh. They began talking to each other, and the only word I understood was Israel, Israel, Israel. They knew all about the ways Israel could farm productively in arid conditions, and the reason they knew was that farmers from the district had been invited to participate in Mashav training programs.
Amazing, amazing. So a very far cry from the way in which we're typically associated with Israel, right? This on? For the purpose of the online folks, we'll just do it this way real quick. Mashav has worked in 140 countries, doing, you call 9 specialties: food security, education, public health, research and development, empowering civil society, promoting entrepreneurship, women empowerment, rural and urban development, and humanitarian aid. I want to ask a question now that relates to a sense of purpose, because everybody would agree that Israel has a foundational purpose to be a safe haven and home in our ancestral homeland for the Jewish world, for the Jewish people. Everyone understands that purpose. But because of this book, I think people will come to understand another purpose, a purpose that actually goes back to Genesis chapter 12, when God calls Abraham to form a covenant and to become a source of blessing to the nations of the world through this work. And you write about one organization that's near and dear to Debbie and myself. My wife, we were very close with the Amin Ord Youth Village. You tell the story of Amin Ord, a remarkable youth village in Mount Carmel. Many of us know it. And I've always known for years that it became the model in parts of Africa for other places that have had tremendous problems with children that didn't have parents, right? And especially in the wake of terrible human slaughter and genocide. And one of the things you write, I wonder if you tell the story itself about this whole approach. But one of the things, I'm going to ask a two-part question. First, I'm going to ask you to tell that story, and then what you write is you say the safety of the children, the safety or make sure I get it right, the well-being of the child drives all decisions in the Agahozu Shalom Youth Village. I love this idea because it reminds sometimes of the Simon Sinek idea of start with why, know your why, right? If there's something that drives all decisions, then it's absolutely clarifying in terms of what you're there for. And it just feels like from the 50s, in the most desperate of circumstances, initially by the government, but subsequently by lots of non-government organizations in the thousands now, people have understood what's driven decisions. And that is to try to take the tools that Israel develops and share those as widely and as comprehensively and as consistently as possible. And so I wonder if you'd tell the story of how a youth village on Mount Carmel literally became a whole methodology in a very important and desperate part of Africa.
I love the story of Agahozu Shalom. So the story is that it also relates to the Rwandan genocide, which happened in 1994, and about 1 million people were killed in the course of 100 days. 1 million people were murdered in the course of 100 days, mostly the Tutsi of Rwanda. In 2005, a remarkable woman named Anne Heyman and her husband, Seth Marin, they decided to host a fundraiser to help survivors of the genocide. And they had an evening, and the speaker was talking about the genocide and the ramification 9 years later. And Anne Heyman asked a question. She was a lawyer living in New York, not an expert in genocide, not an expert in Rwanda, had never been on the African continent, but she said, "What is the great challenge?" And the speaker, a survivor of the genocide, said, "We're a country of 11 million people and we have 1 million orphans. In a situation like that, there is no hope." And not unlike Jacob, that line sat with Anne, and she couldn't get past it. She couldn't let it go. And she said, "Well, surely there's something that we can do. 1 million orphans, that's astounding. It's hard to think about it." And she thought about the Holocaust, and she started asking around, and people kept telling her about this kibbutz-style youth village in Israel, near Haifa, called Yamin Ord. And it was founded after the Holocaust in Israel's early years to take in Jewish orphans of the Holocaust and to give them sort of a community family environment to grow up in because they didn't have anything else. And they've since been taking in youth at risk for many, many years. And so they had a particular expertise. So Anne sends an email to the man who was the director at the time. It says, "You don't know me, but I'm hoping you can help me." And when she explains what she's trying to do, he says, "I'm absolutely going to help you." And what Anne starts doing, she starts traveling back and forth between Israel and Rwanda, and she's just talking to as many people as she can. And she convinces the Rwandan government to allow her to buy 44 acres of land, about an hour outside of Kigali, the capital, in what is really spectacularly beautiful area. I've been to Agahozu Shalom village. And she says the youth village has to be situated on a hill, because for children to go far, they have to be able to see far. And the entire mentality, philosophy of Agahozo Shalom is built on Yemin Ord and the dignity of a child and giving them a stable home environment and doing what is best in the welfare of the child. So Agahozo Shalom is set up as a series of little houses. It really looks like if you were walking through a kibbutz. And in every house, you have about 15, 20 teenagers that live there with what they call the house mama. And the mama is normally a Rwandan woman who lost her children in the genocide. And she is responsible for taking care of those teenagers, for making sure they go to school and do their homework and go to their therapy classes and their other classes. And it really becomes their own family with their siblings. And they have the most incredible activities. They can learn any musical instrument and coding, and really astounding what's made available to them. And they continue to get advice and resources from Yemin Ord. The instructors go back and forth between Yemin Ord and Agahozo Shalom. And what they've done is that they've taken from what was these children who were orphaned from the genocide, as time went on and there weren't orphans anymore, they went and they looked for the most at-risk youth in Rwanda, and that's where they pull them from. And sometimes it's children who have no parents because they died because of AIDS or whatever the case might be. And those are the children, and they graduate at 100% rate. Many of them end up with scholarships to come to school here in the United States. And then they go back to Rwanda and they've gone and done the most amazing things. They become doctors and engineers and all sorts of things, and they're contributing to building up the country. It's in the pragmatism section, just for that reason.
Beautiful. So I want to talk about the idea of continuing and the influence of long-term, thank you, Barnett, for everything. The way we stick with these, because I want to talk a little bit, I want to introduce Yotam. So our friend Yotam, who was here for Shabbat dinner in March, Yotam Polazar, who is the hero of Israel Aid, who they pride themselves on being the first in and the last out. What blew me away was not the fact that they show up immediately, whenever you hear Israel shows up on the scene of a natural disaster, it's generally them. They're scouting it out. They have people that live not far from the airport. They get on planes immediately. They figure out where to locate the emergency humanitarian response. Sometimes it's rescuing people out of rubble. But what blew me away was the idea that the average stay in these countries is years. 5 years, sometimes 10 years. They grow capacity from within the local population. They earn trust. They bring humility. They don't know the culture. They don't know the country. They want to listen and learn. They show they care. Somebody once said, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. They show that very, very powerfully. And so I wonder if you'd say a word about trust and the way that Israel Aid and Yotam, first of all, feel free to comment on Yotam because he's quite a remarkable guy who we were privileged to get to meet. And he's so busy because, frankly, these days, as many of us know, they're doing work inside Israel for the first time ever. Right? They've been all over the world to disaster areas. They found themselves in the south of Israel after October the 7th. But what it means to not just be the first in, but to be the last out, and to build capacity and to teach people that this is not the story of people coming to help them, but their own story of how they can ultimately grow the capacity to help themselves.
Yotam is amazing. He's a friend. I've had the chance to see projects of Israel Aid on the ground in Nepal and in Guatemala. Actually, Yotam and I last week were in DC together doing a talk together about the book. He's truly amazing. Israel Aid is different. It's probably the largest and most well-known of Israel's international relief organizations. And what makes Israel Aid distinct from all the others is, first of all, the incredible speed by which they can deploy to a crisis zone. They can normally do it within 48 hours. But what's more impressive is that the world's focus is right there when the crisis is on, when the earthquake happens or when the tsunami happens. But then most relief organizations leave after a few weeks. And the problem is that the community is still devastated. The people are still deeply traumatized. So Israel aid stays literally for years. Because first it's that emergency relief, and then it's rebuilding a community, and then it's the ongoing mental health and trauma support. And that's really what they're providing, and that's why it's years and years on the ground, long after the cameras are gone, and there's no credit to be had anymore. That's the first thing that makes them distinct. Now, Yotam tricked me, because he was supposed to, everybody has one chapter in the book. That was the deal. And this isn't actually the story of Israel Aid that I wanted to tell in the book. I wanted to put him in the chutzpahism section, because when the US withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021 and they left the crisis, there were so many Afghans that were trying to figure out how to escape the country because they were terrified of what would happen when the Taliban regained control. You're talking about judges who had prosecuted members of the Taliban. You're talking about the female robotics team, the female cycling team, human rights, journalists, all these people and their families. And they were desperately calling whomever they could. So, Tom, who works in all different countries, kept getting phone calls saying, how are we going to help these people get out of Afghanistan? He said, we don't work in a country like Afghanistan. They work in countries where they're actually asking permission from the government to be able to enter. And Afghanistan, especially under the Taliban, is not letting any Israelis in. But he kept getting these phone calls, and sort of just the lineup of people who called him, he sort of formulated a plan. Now, Yotam is not a guy that thinks things through from beginning to end. He's a guy through and through Israeli who's like, I got the first step worked out, we'll just figure it out from there. And he figured, I'm gonna try a rescue mission, and I'm gonna try to rescue some of these people. It is inordinately complicated what he had to work out. You have to go, first of all, you have to find people. You have to gather them together, and then you can't get them out of the airport. If you remember the scenes at the airport, first of all, there was the crush of people, then there was the suicide bomber, then the horrific photos of the planes taking off with people trying to cling on for dear life. So the airport is a non-issue. And then the Taliban has set up checkpoints all over the place. He has to figure out how to get them out of the country on a land crossing, getting past all these checkpoints. And then he discovers most of them don't have a passport. So you can't get them into another country. You also have to figure out how to get another country to accept them, to open its borders. And piece by piece, phone call after phone call, all hours of the day and night, using every resource and network imaginable, he starts to figure this out. His board member was married to Michael Oren, who had diplomatic connections to the former Afghani ambassador to the United States, and he figured out that he could get them passports. But then how do you get the passports in? First, you have to smuggle passports into the country so you can smuggle people out of the country. And at one point, these people are stopped at a checkpoint. The passports are confiscated. I mean, it's really one of the most astounding stories. And he does it once, and then he figures, I can do it again. And he did try again. It got even more complicated and more dangerous each time. He ultimately actually did save all the people that he attempted to rescue, including the last Jew, and Afghanistan, somebody else who was at risk. But I want to read you something that is in the book. So this book was submitted to my publisher 6 weeks before October 7th. And after October 7th, I redrafted the introduction to the book, but I also went back to all the people I interviewed and asked if they wanted to write a postscript about the impact of October 7th on them or on their work. And this is the one that he gave me two, because he got 2 chapters, but this is one of the ones that Yotam gave me. And this is what he writes. 2 days after the October 7 Hamas massacre in southern Israel, I received this note from former Afghan ambassador to the United States, Saeed Jawad. So what follows is the note from Saeed to Yotam. And he writes, Yotam, my friend, I'm writing with a very heavy heart to express my deepest condolences and profound sympathy for the recent barbaric terrorist attacks in Israel. I hope your family, friends, and loved ones are safe. The news of the terrorist attack is devastating, and my thoughts have been with you and my friends in Israel during this difficult time. I personally feel the pain and grief as my own people have experienced the horrors of terrorism for decades. I understand all too well the profound impact such acts of violence can have on individuals, families, and communities. The strength and resilience of the Jewish community show the power of human spirit in the face of savagery and callousness. Please know that we are here for you as a friend and as someone who profoundly feels your pain. May the memories of the innocent victims be a blessing, and may their families find solace in the support of friends during these very difficult times. My thoughts and prayers are with you, with families of the victims, and all those affected by this terrible tragedy. With heartfelt sympathy and solidarity, Ambassador Saeed Jawad.
Very powerful indeed. So I do want to make space if somebody wants to ask a question, make a comment. As you're thinking and formulating, I just want to ask Aviva a question about the people who, and by the way, I think what you just read from the Afghani, right, is the postscript letters. There's some very moving things that are expressed in them from all parts of the world, from Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, and from all. You also chart the way in which this worked. It started in Africa, and then it went toward Asia, and then it was in Latin America, and it was all over the globe. Anywhere will be accepted. In some cases of the chutzpah, the chutzpah folks, sometimes where we're not accepted, they just show up and incognito. There are people today who are cynical and say, well, this is all nice, but Israel's only telling these stories to sort of cover up ugly things, right? They used to call it, I guess they used to call it pink washing, and then they call it rubble washing. That's the term now.
Or aid washing, yeah.
Aid washing. What was it?
Rubble washing or aid washing.
Aid washing. So how do you respond to people? We're well aware, by the way, of the people out there for whom Israel could do no right and Israel's enemies can do no wrong. That's one reality. But there are people who want to focus on things that are imperfect about Israel, and God knows there are many things that are imperfect about Israel. That humanizes Israel. It doesn't idealize Israel, right? How do you respond to, you touch on it at the end of the book, the people who look at this as kind of like apologetics?
So first of all, I scoff at the idea that somebody says to me, well, Israel is just doing this to make itself look better, because who knew this? No, nobody knows these stories. That's the whole reason I wrote Standup Nation, is that people don't know these untold story of Israel's work in international.
It's a secret, so they're doing a really important job of trying to make themselves look better.
We're doing it and then cynically not telling anybody. It's sort of a ridiculous notion. But I think it goes to a bigger question of how do you know when it's an honest criticism of Israel? Not just, then you can apply it to all the washing, the pink washing and the aid washing and all the rest of it. And that's an interesting question that I think about a great deal in my profession and on social media and the work that I'm doing. And of course, Natan Sharansky gave us the 3 Ds to distinguish between anti-Zionists and honest critics of Israel: demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. But I actually think, don't tell this to Natan Sharansky, I think it's actually much simpler than this, which is that our friends, our real friends and the honest critics of Israel, are asking us to do better while standing beside me, helping me to do better. And the person that makes that sort of accusation is probably standing accusatorily and pointing at me. And that's how I make the distinction. Is somebody trying to build me up, and is my partner in building me up, or are they just trying to tear me down?
I would just add, it's a beautiful distinction. I would just add that in Hebrew, there's a very interesting word play on the relationship between tzionut and siniut, right? That we say siniut is cynicism, tzionut is Zionism. So Zionism, you say yes to Zionism and no to cynicism. They're actually quite opposites. And when I'm in Israel and I'm chatting with, every now and then I'll bump into somebody who will say, the phrase in Hebrew is im kvar az kvar, this idea that somehow, no matter what we do, they're going to condemn us, which is not a posture. I understand what brings Israelis to that point, believe me, I do. But it's not a Zionist position. The real Zionist position says yes to taking responsibility, to finding a way to turn very, very painful circumstance, the whole story of this book, turning a very, very painful plight into service for greater good. Right? That's our authentic posture, not a cynical one. Other comments, questions for Aviva? I have, yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much, Aviva. Are you guys still doing the delegations to Africa and touring the world?
I wish I was, but no, we're not.
Yeah, it's she's daily hitting a. How many tweets would you guess you're doing every day? We're not going to guess. It's a lot. Anybody who follows, you all should follow Aviva, and you should post that everybody else should follow Aviva because we got to get her 600,000 followers. But, and by the way, let's just be clear. By having 300,000, let's assume that every follower talks to at least 2 people, probably 2 to 3 people. So that's 1 million right there. Okay. Let me share one more question, and then we'll make space if anybody else would like to ask. It's actually about the future. So this figure, JC, okay, talks about how when he's growing up, he's from where?
He's Rwandan.
Rwandan again. We're back in Rwanda.
He's the director of Agahozo Shalom Youth Village.
Thank you. So he talks about how when he's growing up, his parents have a habit. And the habit is to essentially, because they moved around a lot, right? As a boy, JC lived in Mali, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Chad, Gambia, Burkina Faso.
His father worked for the UN. So
Thank you. Sierra Leone.
Posted all over the place.
Niger, Senegal, etc. He says we moved every 2 or 3 years. But my parents were smart. Each time they told us that the place we were going was the most incredible place. Mind you, some of these places didn't have electricity or clean water, but my parents found something to get us excited. They would say it's the most beautiful mountains, or we'd get to swim in the Atlantic Ocean. It's actually a great way to parent, I suppose. What could you say, mindful that these are very dark and difficult and heavy times for our people? The loss is incalculable. We don't know what's coming. What could you say based on the telling of this story, the weaving of this story, as Lital said, for the first time, it's actually brought together brilliantly. What could you tell us that might excite us about the next move? Hard question.
In the world after October 7th, part of what is so painful is that we don't know when the end of the pain is and how much more pain we have to endure. And we can't predict the future, but I find it helpful to look backwards, to help me look forwards. And it's not the first time Israel has found itself isolated, fighting for its survival, facing economic boycotts, without losing friends by the day. That's the same context that Israel found itself in its earliest years. And it had a choice to make. It would have been perfectly reasonable. It would have perhaps been the wiser decision to turn inwards and say, we're just going to have to look after ourselves in this moment right now. But that's not what they did. In the most desperately poor time of the state, they decide they're going to help people from countries all over the world. And in this moment, I think we're also trying to figure out where we go from here. And there is so much to say about what has gone wrong in the past 10 months. And I think for years we'll be talking about what went wrong militarily and in the government and in the intelligence community and just in the individuals in the government. Endlessly there is to talk about that. And I spend a lot of time doing research about public opinion polling and what do people think and what do Jews think and studying. But the last 10 months have been a revelation because you don't need to hire a fancy survey firm to know exactly who the Jewish people are. Beginning on October 7th, when the moment Israelis understood the magnitude of the attack and that our enemies were preying on the weakest members of our society, the number of Israelis who decided that they were going to jump in a car and drive south with or without a uniform, with or without a gun. Stories of absolute heroism of many people who lost their lives on that day trying to rescue people, as well as the people that were able to survive and to save lives. And then what you saw is the Israeli civil society rise up to take care of the survivors and the evacuees and fill in all the gaps where the government was absent. It was focused on trying to figure out the military response and the chaos in the south. And there were endless amounts of needs, and that's where Israeli people stepped in. And then you have American Jewry and World Jewry that raised phenomenal sums of money and that collected every manner of good needed and sent it to Israel. Did it matter if the IDF needed it or whether it passed standards? It did not matter. We were sending it every plane, duffel bag after duffel bag in our need. And then you saw the incredible work being done of advocacy by organizations like the IAC to bring attention to the hostages, to raise awareness, to fight anti-Semitism, endless. In the last 10 months, we have gotten to see the character of the Jewish people, and it is magnificent. And nothing can take that away from us. Nobody can take that away from us. So I think in looking at who we are as a people, that's what gives me hope.
Beautiful. And listening to you, dear Aviva Klompas, as somebody who, in your own way, with your own remarkable voice and your amazing communication gifts and your clarity and your passion and your persistence, you are one of those people that gives us a tremendous amount of hope. You are a treasure. We are profoundly grateful to you for this book, and we can't wait to read it, invite others to read it, and to internalize its lesson so that what's around the corner will be worthy of credible hope indeed. Thank you so much, dear Aviva Klompas. Thank you all very much.